Stanwich, and I'm the Senior Curator at Gallery Oldham and responsible for revealing histories here at Gallery Oldham. Thank you very much for coming. This afternoon we've got a panel of speakers for you. We're each going to do a very short presentation and then open up the floor to discussion and debate. This afternoon we're very lucky to have Dr. Alan Rice from the University of Central Lancashire, who's been extremely busy over 2007, I would say, and been very closely involved in revealing histories. He's the author of Radical Narratives of the Black Atlantic, which was published a few years ago. And next to him we've got David Pugh, who is the Social History Curator at Rochdale, and this is a joint event with Touchstones Rochdale, as I'm sure many of you will have picked up by now. This is Muli Amai, who's a writer and has also been involved in several Revealing Histories events, and Dominique Tessier, who was involved in Revealing Histories many years ago and is a local historian. So, Alan, would you like to kick off?
Hello everyone. I was just going to briefly outline, my remit is really to outline the horrors of slavery, which is really, I always start off by talking about numbers, because people often know about numbers and they often get complicated by numbers in terms of thinking about slavery. It's often said that 12 million enslaved Africans were exported from Africa to the Americas. That doesn't tell the whole story of slavery, though. It's been estimated that there's another group of people who are always forgotten when we talk about slavery. And that group of people are those people who were marched in coffles from the interior of Africa to the coasts. And it's been estimated that about a third of those who were marched to the coasts either died on the march or died in the slave forts, in the dungeons of the slave forts, before they even got on board the ships. So when we hear these numbers, this number of 12 million, which is a pretty accurate account of every slave ship voyage we know about, of course there are slave ship voyages we don't know about, then we need to actually factor in that there are whole groups of people affected by the slave trade, whole groups of enslaved Africans who are forgotten about, enslaved Africans whose deaths have been utterly unremembered. And that's before we get on the ships. And of those 12 million exported on the ships, 12 million enslaved Africans, over 1 million of them didn't reach, 1.5 million of them didn't reach the other side, and died on the ships, were murdered on the ships, were thrown overboard, various different ways that they died on those ships. So the whole story of the transatlantic slave trade is a story of horror. Now, some people have called the slave trade the African Holocaust, and I think in some ways that some people have talked about that being exaggeration. But the way in which I'd like to just briefly talk about one aspect of what happened to slaves in America, not all the time, but in one aspect, just to talk to you and just for you to think about the Holocaust and what happened to Jews in the concentration camps. And this is an enslaved African in the Carolinas. And as a favour to the doctor who'd saved his life, his master handed over his slave for medical experimentation. And the slave was, slave William Grimes was his name, wrote his autobiography later and detailed what happened to him. And at this time, in the 1840s, there was a debate as to how black skin was. And the doctor, as part of his medical experimentation, did a live dissection on William Grimes to try and see how deep the black of his skin went down. He survived that live dissection. He survived, not only survived, but actually escaped to his freedom. But what I want you to think about is, people have often talked about how there's the comparison between the Holocaust, the African Holocaust, say, and the Shoah, the death of the Jews, and the extermination of the Jews in the camps is an over-exaggeration. Well, what I'd like to say is that maybe, and this is a theory which people have been talking about for a few years, maybe Hitlerism came about out of the experimentations of earlier times around race. the idea that racial difference meant racial exploitation. And when we think about the horrors, maybe that's something to think about, is that actually the horrors of the 21st century happened to Africans in the slave trade beforehand, or the 20th century, sorry, and indeed on into the 21st century, the genocides we see now. So that it's an extreme example of something that happened in slavery. It's one that is documented, and William Grimes's autobiography can be read by us all. And it's a wonderful story to an extent of the survival and the survival of someone into freedom and his escape into freedom, and then his witness to the conditions he endured under slavery. And then I just want to say one further thing, really, that when we think about this area, especially the area around Oldham and Rochdale, and we think about what made these areas rich, we think about cotton. And there's often talk about, well, you know, someone else would have used the cotton, what's our debt, etc. I was going to show you a couple of graphs, and they show that in the 1790 there were only 700,000 slaves in America. Because of the development of cotton, much of which was exported to this area, by the end of by the beginning of the American Civil War, there were 4 million enslaved Africans in the southern states of America. That population growth is due to the use of slave-produced cotton in places like Lancashire. Without that, Lancashire would not be rich, and Lancashire's riches were dependent on slave-produced cotton. And the graphs are just absolutely... Because there was no importation of Africans to America after 1807. There was only 500,000 black Africans exported via the slave trade to the Americas. The exponential growth of slaves in America is caused by slave-produced cotton. The market for that is in industrial Britain. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.